Well, hello there. This is Shane from Shane's Books and Review, and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. We're going to be talking about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and the name of that is His Last Bow, some Reminiscences of Sherlock Holmes. And the short story opening it up on our mini-series will be The Adventures of Wisteria Lodge. Quite frankly, this one, not one of my favorite short stories that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle ever put out. Of course, in the opening, we have Sherlock and Watson at Baker Street, and there's this guy that shows up with a plight, John Scott Essells, who has something of the grotesque that he needs to speak of with Sherlock. But as is the case usually, inspectors start showing up at Baker Street just as soon as this guy gets here. It's Inspector Gregerson and Inspector Baines. And then also, the inspectors are looking for a statement from Mr. Essells about what had happened the night before, as they found a note in the dead man's pocket that kind of indicated that Essells would be in the victim's house that night. Essells is kind of confused and dismayed to hear about the death of the person that he was visiting, which I love the name Aloysius. Aloysius was beaten to death about 1 o'clock in the morning, and Mr. Essells, he was spending the night at Wisteria Lodge in Aloysius Garcia's little rented cabin. But when Mr. Essells woke up in the morning, he found, oh my goodness, oh my gracious, everybody's gone. What am I going to do? The thing that's got Mr. Essells so confused and upset is he remembered about 1 o'clock in the morning that Aloysius Garcia had come in and asked him about a rug, or if he had a rug. There's a little bit of a backstory here, which was okay. It had to do with the way that Mr. Essells and Aloysius had met, and they had this strange friendship that just kind of happened real quick like. They got on so well that Aloysius invited Mr. Essells to come stay at his house, but whenever he got there, Mr. Essells felt like something was just astray. Something was maybe a little bit off. As the day went on, he noticed that there was just like this mood in the house, that things just were the ambience wasn't quite right. Now, this is me paraphrasing. This wasn't actually in the story, but you know, that's kind of what he's expressing to the inspectors and to Sherlock. And things actually turned for the much, much worse whenever Aloysius Garcia was handed a note by his servant that evening. Mr. Essells left. I think that he went to like a real estate agent or something like that and asked about the rent on the house out of concern, and he found out that it was paid in full, even though nobody was there. And even better yet, the embassy had never heard of Garcia whatsoever. Inspector Baines produces a note to Sherlock and everybody that has this coded message of colors and turn here and do this and that. So it's thought that perhaps it was maybe a tryst or a jealous husband trying to get revenge, but the note was wrote in a lady's writing. This is one of the reasons why the story isn't one of my favorites, because towards the end of it, Baines has pretty well decided that it was about 1 o'clock whenever Garcia was beaten to death. But Sherlock kind of theorizes or comes up with an idea that maybe Garcia had tampered with the clocks beforehand. That way he would have an alibi by asking about the rug with Mr. Essells, so that even though he was gone, Mr. Essells thought it was 1 o'clock in the morning, whenever in fact it was probably more like 10 in the evening. In conclusion to that story, about the most that Sherlock was able to give about that was perhaps the murderer lives in a big house close to the Wisteria Lodge. And that wrapped that one out. I mean, it wasn't notable in any way. I mean, it was a little bit of a mystery. It was, of course, a Sherlock story, but it didn't have those moments that get you going. And that does it for The Adventure of Wisteria Lodge. Now, on to our next one. Believe it or not, it doesn't have the word adventure in it. Whoa! The Tiger of San Pedro. In this one, Watson and Sherlock, or Sherlock and Watson, whichever way you want to look at that, are going with Escher to Wisteria Lodge to see Inspector Baines. So it's kind of a tie-in to the first story. And in this one, there's a point where Sherlock really kind of gets into the inspector, and he's like, look, man, you know, if I didn't know that you weren't a man for drink or drugs, man, I'd rake you over the coals for this. But essentially, what they're investigating is that the constable guarding the house saw something incredibly frightful, something that he describes as the devil himself, as a face popping into the window and disappearing. But he gave chase. And of course, the intruder did get away. Sherlock slightly believes him, not necessarily the situation, but he believes that there was a person there, and he does that by looking for footprints. And he does find them. And inside that house, a few oddly typed items are found, like a bird carcass that's been pulled apart and something that resembles a baby wrapped up like a mummy. There was also a pail of blood, and there was a platter full of charred bones. And later on in this little story, Sherlock does kind of link all this stuff together with voodoo, which voodoo and hoodoo are two different things, bro. They really are. Now, the way this ties into it is This is just 5 days after the murder of Garcia. So I'm kind of thinking that, and I'm hoping that these stories are all going to tie together in a way, which would be kind of cool. And especially considering the way they were released as serials. So instead of having disjuncted stories where one doesn't really tie into the other, but they're self-containing, it would be really neat if this was a full-on tied together story by the end. I would go for that. That would be cool. It was just 5 days after the initial murder, and Holmes is just astonished because it looks like our good man Inspector Baines has arrested somebody. And that somebody is a tank of a man, a brutish individual, which was the cook. Of course, the cook doesn't break under interrogation. He just grunts and that kind of a thing. And Sherlock does try to warn off Inspector Baines that this probably isn't your guy. But Inspector Baines does the thing that most inspectors in the Sherlock stories do. He fluffs up like a peacock and goes, "No, I am, and I will figure out. And this is," all that kind of a thing. Now, the next day after his little warning, he does spend a good portion of the day going from house to house and asking people things and shops and this, that, and the other, and does come up to something. And what he comes to is at one of the households. It was the Hendersons, and at the Hendersons he finds out some interesting things. And those things are just that his little girls, they have a English governess, but also the biggest thing came from somebody that got sacked or fired. That was a gardener, and come to find out the Hendersons, of course, are rich, but Mr. Henderson himself is really afraid of something. So this kind of puts Sherlock right on the trail, and he starts sniffing even harder. And he finds out the Henderson is kind of a violent individual. Now, that cryptic note that we mentioned that was in the previous story, it apparently came from the Hendersons. The writer of that note was Miss Burnett, which hasn't been seen since the murder. Sherlock comes up with one of his grand plans so that he can strike at the heart of the mystery, as it were, but he fails. Oh no. He finds out that the family has fled. Well, that one's done. But there are some interesting little tidbits of information, like Miss Burnett. She apparently was drugged and she didn't want to go. As a side note, the Hendersons, Mr. Henderson specifically, has been identified at this point by Inspector Baines. And he is no one other than Don Juan Murillo, which was the Tiger of San Pedro, a very much hated and feared individual from Central America. And that kind of brings us to the wrapping up point of this, because Aloysius Garcia, he wasn't from Spain, as originally thought. No, instead he was from San Pedro, and he got himself wrapped up in a revenge plot and killed by the Hendersons. And Miss Barnett, I suspect, was indeed the wife of our Aloysius Garcia. That was the reason why she wrote that note. And on top of all that, once he was slain by Henderson, the Hendersons escaped and went back to Central America, slipping the police. However, justice was served by life, and they were too killed. And on to our next and final one for the day. Woo! If by chance you're wondering why I'm not sitting in my chair, The Adventure of the Cardboard Box, that was originally wrote in 1892, was a republication. So I refuse the dogmatic principles of the man, and I am not going to review this a second time. But seriously, to recap that one, it was The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. And if you remember, that was the one that had the story about the landlady that received a box that had some ears in it, and it was a love triangle in a way where this one guy loses his mind on a boat and ends up getting their ears and sending it to the sister. Yep. Now, to the third one that's in this book. Now, it was a good story, though. I don't want to downplay it. Actually, out of all of them, that was the one that kind of stuck with me the most. It's not the best one in it, by far, but it's certainly not the worst. It was just interesting. The third one we're going to talk about today is The Adventure of the Red Circle. And this one's an interesting little conundrum. Miss Warren shows up at Baker Street asking to speak, of course, with Watson and Sherlock. Come to find out, she's concerned about a tenant that she has. Now, here's the odd situation. The tenant was like, "Hey, I want this room and I will pay you so much as long as you just let me have the room under my own way of doing things. So don't bother me. If I'm hungry, I'll ring the bell. If I have needs, I'll write it down. Just leave me be." That was okay at first for her, but it became obvious that there was some kind of bad situation, because even though the money was paid and they were both abiding by the terms that he had set forth, Miss Warren felt that there was something maybe a little bit off. Now, whenever some questions start being asked, it's found that the person that came to rent the room was a young man with a beard, and he had heavily accented English. And on the first night, he He left and asked her not to bar the door, asked for a key, all that kind of a thing, and then he came back later on. Since then, they haven't seen him come or go. Ms. Warren, being aware of Sherlock's incredible ways with cigars and matches, brought some of those items to him and comes to the conclusion that the cigarettes in particular had been smoked without a holder, which is kind of unusual for a man with a beard because they were smoked so short. And this person eats very, very little. Now, after Miss Warren leaves, Sherlock confides to Watson that he feels like maybe the person in the room isn't the one that came and rented the room. He's come to this conclusion because the English that things are wrote. Some of the verbiage or descriptions would be slightly wrong. The one newspaper that was requested by the lodger, Sherlock feels like that's being used to send messages to the person staying in the room. It seems that Sherlock is right because in the classified or message or wanted or whatever it is in that time period, Sherlock starts seeing these messages. Whenever the path clears, I'll signal you. Don't forget the signal now. 1 is A, 2 is B, etc. And it seems like there is a direct message and they're always with a signed G. He does find another clue because I think it was the next day, he ends up with a message in this post where it says, "Red tall house across from you, this window, be watching." And then at that point, Mrs. Warren shows up all upset because her husband had gotten beaten and that's enough. She's had it. They need to confront whoever's in that room. And Sherlock, of course, comes to the conclusion that they mistook her husband for the lodger because of the beard, and he's very lucky that they realized to drop her husband out of the carriage. Yeah. Now we come to the plotting. Sherlock comes up with a plan where he's going to be in a particular place to watch at the door whenever the person takes the food. They surely find out that the person taking the food is not the lodger that came and paid the rent. Instead, it is a lovely woman, a young lady that has been lodging upstairs in this Warren's home. It is at that point where Sherlock starts to postulate that maybe the two are either lovers that have run away or husband and wife and they're in danger. Hence all the secrecy and trying to hide their identity. Like the handwriting was very common block letters. She was trying to hide that she was not indeed Mel with her handwriting. Because of the message that was in the post earlier, Sherlock and Watson were there to see what was happening. They wanted to get the message. And the message that is sent is attention, 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 but in Italian. It was with an A at the end of it, a small a, which means for a lady. Then he starts to say danger, danger, but the second message gets interrupted altogether. Realizing that the signaler is probably in a whole lot of danger or something bad is happening, Sherlock and Watson run over to where he was signaling at and runs into Inspector Gregson and a United States Pinkerton detective, there they are again, named Leverton. Sherlock takes a moment to wax on the Pinkerton detective, naming him the hero, the Long Island cave mystery. Yes, indeed. And Sherlock finds out that those two are waiting for Giuseppe Gorgiano. And that happens to be a person that Sherlock is actually fairly aware of. Because of where Gregerson and Leverton were stationed, they were unaware of where or if there had been light signals or anything like that. They just knew that they were pretty sure they had their guy cornholed in that room because there was only one door in and out. Now, upon entering this house, with the one door, there is a gruesome scene that is found by them. They find that Gorgiano had been gruesomely murdered, and the three men that they mentioned leaving earlier, one of them was the young man that is the partner to the lady that is having residency above Mrs. Warren. While they're talking about this, the young lady surprises all of them by bursting in. The reason why it was such a surprise for everybody else is they did not know that Sherlock had signaled her to let her know that all was clear and all was well. Come on over. And her name was Amelia Luca. And she had a backstory that is told at that point that had to do with this giant that was dead on the ground. See, quite apparently, he decided that he was in love with her and was going to take her. This guy was a really bad guy to begin with, kind of a mobster type, and her and her husband had fled to get away from him, but he followed incessantly. Gennaro is her husband, and Gennaro was actually being chased by him, not only because this giant that was so cruel had fallen in love with her, but because the giant wanted to kill her husband, and she was so very proud of her husband for dispatching him. She tells the entire story to the inspectors of both Pinkerton and Gregson and Sherlock and Watson. And they all kind of come to the conclusion, look, if your husband were to come in and tell us this story, that's going to be good enough. He's probably not going to be taken from you or severely punished. Because this is, after all, a really bad person that we've been after for quite some time. And since really all that was in self-defense, more than likely nothing would come of it at all. I'm curious, have you read any of these short stories? If you have, I'd love to know what you think about them down there. What did you think about it? Have you read that short story? If you haven't, I encourage it because it is kind of a good read, and whenever it comes to Sherlock, it's It's very typical, but it's also in the details that makes that one pretty good. Now, would I rank it with the Hounds or the Valley of Fear or something like that? No, because it's a short story. But for a short story, it's really well done. Now's the point where I say, hey, I would love to know what you think about these. And I would. So if you do, if you want to tell me, please do leave me some comments down there in that comment section, and I'll post them in the next video. Again, we just covered the first 3 stories of His Last Bow, a Reminiscence of Sherlock Holmes, wrote by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Like, share, and subscribe if you would. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. This has been Shane from Shane's Books and Review. I'll see you Monday.